So, yeah, thank you. Woo for that. Yeah, thank you for that pity clap. So as Caleb was giving us that wrap-up of where we've been and what James, one of the first leaders of the Christian church, had for us walking through the book, we're going to finish up tonight with chapter 4 and a wee bit of chapter 5. And tonight what we're looking at is seeing how love is what will help to spread our faith. And we'll be looking from the perspective that how we treat others, especially how we treat fellow Christians, is what's going to draw people ultimately to Christ. In chapter 4, though, James talks about sort of the opposite of that. And we're going to really be looking at the opposite of love most of tonight, talking about how our normal mode of operation is to fight, right? And James is going to give us, we're going to look at 3 root causes for fighting and conflict in the body of believers in the church. We're going to talk about coveting and what that means, slander, gossip, and judging. All right, so let's dive in to chapter 4 here, looking at chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, and see the first cause of fighting in the church. All right, in chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire, but you do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight." So James relates here the root cause, the first root cause that we're going to look at of fighting, back to the root of really all of our problems, and that's the sin desire within us, right? If you were here, I don't know how long ago it was, maybe a month ago or so, right? I talked about the 3 lusts, right? The mode that the pattern of the world follows that is fueled by our sin desires. The 3 lusts are the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, which doesn't have the word lust in it, but it's the lust for power and position, right? And we talked about that and how we get, molded into that and have to change our mindset. So here in chapter 4, James is using a different word for that encapsulates those 3 lusts down into one word, and that word is coveting. So I don't know how often you use that word coveting in your normal vocabulary, but simply put, coveting is wanting anything that someone else has that you don't have, right? So and you may be thinking, well, okay, but is that really that big a deal? Well, yeah, right? Because all of those 3 lusts can be summed up under coveting, right? The desire for a person or a relationship that someone has that you don't have, right? It's the lust of the flesh. The desire for things, right? Money, possessions that someone's got that you don't have. The lust of the eyes. The desire for, power or position that someone else has. It's the pride of life. God thought coveting was so important, actually, that he listed it in the 10 Commandments. It was actually commandment number 10, and the ends of lists are very important in the Bible. So let's actually look at that. So in Exodus 20, verse 17, this is the 10th commandment. God says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, or his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." So check it out. God thinks it's so important to warn us about coveting that he doesn't just say don't covet, but he actually breaks it down for us and gives us some specific examples of coveting from the verse. And so let's dive in and look at them real quickly, because some of them make sense just reading through it from our perspective, but some you kind of needed to be in the culture of the time to really understand some of them. So let me dive in here. The first one that makes sense to us, don't covet your neighbor's house, right? Okay, and God's not just saying you can covet everything else, just not his house. Like you can covet his lawn, you can covet, his car. No, just put the possessions there, right? So what God's trying to get us is don't covet the possessions, lust of the eyes of your neighbor. Why? Why is that important? Because it causes us to see our neighbor as a rival then instead of someone to love and to minister to. So neighbor's house, that makes sense. Neighbor's wife, this also makes sense, right? It's not just wife, you can covet their husband or whatever, but no, all the relationships, right? Do not covet and do not covet the relationship that someone else has, the lust of the flesh. Why? Because it causes jealousy and envy. We're going to talk more about that tonight. The next two, we really need to understand a little bit more. Do not covet your neighbor's male or female servants. And you may be like, okay, I'm off the hook, right? Because I don't even know anyone that's got any servants of any kind. So what is this about? So in the culture of the time when these were given to the Israelites, having a servant mean you were doing well financially, right? You were able to employ someone to work in your house and do your cooking and stuff like that. So this is more about do not covet the financial position of someone else, right? So don't see it, you're off the hook because you don't know anyone that has servants, but don't covet someone else's money. Don't be jealous of the possessions that they have. The last one there about ox and donkey, once again, you're like, okay, so farmers, don't worry about, can't covet them, but everyone else. So what is this about? This is really important from the culture as well, too. The culture, the service animals that you had represented your livelihood, right? So people with an ox were farmers. They were, plowing the land. People with a donkey were, that was a pack animal, so they were like merchants and things like that. So what is God saying here? This is being jealous, coveting your neighbor's job or their position or their awards. So, and this one right here hits close to home for me because I have struggled with this in my job for several years. So, every year in my department, I'm an English professor at Coastal, if you haven't met me before. I've been a professor there now for 10 years, and every year in our department, they give an award to one of the professors. They're the professor of the year. And you get this cool, golden apple that you get to sit on your desk. And I've always wanted that because it's important, it's good for promotion and tenure. So a couple of years ago, I was nominated. Been nominated several times, but I've never won. So I got nominated, and I thought I had a really good chance to win this year. I go to the place for the ceremony where they're announcing it, and they announce someone else's name. I won't say their name, but I really wanted to win. And instead of just being like, oh man, I wish I would have won, it wasn't just that simple, like, oh man, I didn't win. But no, it turned to jealousy and envy of that person, right? Because I was thinking, I'm a better professor than they are. I know for a fact that people like them so much because everyone makes an A in their class because they don't give grades. And I start having this pity party, people don't like me because my classes are hard and sometimes people fail. So, but God really convicted me of that, is that I was coveting that. And it really did, it put a wedge between me and that other professor. And every year that this word comes up, God convicts me about not coveting when someone else wins, right? And being jealous. Okay, so that's what coveting is. What does it cause in the church? Well, James tells us that this is a major cause of the quarreling and fighting that we see in the church, in the body of believers sometimes. And this is especially bad in the church because Christians are supposed to love one another. So look at what Jesus tells his disciples as he's preparing them to, exist in this world when he's about to leave them. All right, check this out. And this is in John 13. says, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this," pay attention right here. "By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." So Jesus is saying here, the way that people will know that you're a follower of Christ is not by your position. It's not by the things that you stand for. It's not ultimately, by all of these things. Jesus is telling us here, they will know that you're a Christian by the love that you have for the other Christians. So we are supposed to love everybody, but he signals out specifically loving other Christians. Why? Because think about it. If someone is watching you as a Christian and they see you fighting with other people that they know are Christians as well, why are they going to want to be a part of that? Right? Why are they going to want to be a part of a family that's always fighting? It's like I thought that they were supposed to be different, and they can't even love each other. How are they supposed to love anyone else? Coveting distorts our views of our brothers and sisters, and it's impossible to love someone while at the same time coveting what they have. Their relationships, their possessions, their money, their position, the awards that they get. Coveting causes us to see them instead as rivals, creating jealousy and envy. And this is the first root cause of fighting in the church, is coveting. All right, a few verses down in chapter 4, James continues to the next cause of fighting in the church. So let's look at this in James 4, verses 11 through 12. It says, "Brothers and sisters, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against a brother or a sister or judges them speaks against the law and judges it. When you judge the law, you're not keeping it, but you're sitting in judgment on it. And there's only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbor?" All right, so we're going to focus on a couple of things. The first thing from this verse is the specific sin of slander. So once again, at your age, I don't know how many of you go around saying slander. So what the heck is slander? For us, it's going to mean saying something bad about someone. The technical definition of slander usually is for the purpose of trying to ruin someone's reputation. And in English, the word slander is primarily used in courtrooms and stuff for saying things that aren't true about somebody, to defame their character. But the Greek word that James uses here that's translated as slander can also be translated as gossip, right? So gossip may make more sense for you as we look through this. So you ever done that? You ever gossiped? Right? Let me tell you. Did you hear what Haley did the other night? Let me check. Let me tell you what I saw Caleb doing yesterday. It's some good stuff. Hey, did you know what happened with Scott and Kim? Check it out. Sometimes we're even worse, right? Sometimes we try to be spiritual about it, right? We try to make ourselves feel good about gossiping. Guys, we really need to pray for Tom. Because listen to what he did, right? We try to turn it into a prayer request, and it's ultimately really just our way of gossiping. So slander and gossip are huge problems when found in the church, and the Bible is filled with warnings about them. All right? A couple of places in Scripture we'll look at. It was a major concern of Paul when writing to the Corinthian church. In 2 Corinthians 12:20, he says, "I fear that there may be discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, slander, gossip, arrogance, and disorder in the church." And that's why he was writing 2 Corinthians. And he was going to come and deal with those problems. It was a major concern of the Apostle Peter when he was writing his letter to the modern day to churches in what is now modern day Turkey. In 1 Peter 2:1, he says, "Therefore rid yourself of all malice and all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind." And that's exactly what James was also dealing with, and we looked at last week. Tom was telling us about controlling our tongue, because a lot of times that's what our tongue is doing, slandering and gossiping. Okay, so that's what slander is. What does slander actually cause and do? All right, look back here with me at verses 11 and 12 again, James 4. James tells us what we're really doing when we slander each other. Anyone who speaks against a brother or a sister and judges them speaks against the law and judges it. When you judge the law, you're not keeping it, but you're sitting in judgment on it. Right? James is telling, we're not judging them, we're judging the law. We'll get to that. There is one lawgiver and judge, and that's God. Who are you to judge your neighbor? So James says, when we're passing judgment on our fellow believers like this, we're setting ourselves up to be on the same level as God. The one lawgiver and judge. That's who that is. That's why it's capitalized, right? That's God. That is, we're not following God's law. Instead, we're trying to be God and trying to play God, right? And telling everyone else the bad things that they're doing. You know, and James tells us that the reason that this is so bad is because our motivations for it, right? We are judging them to show how much better that we are, right? If I can talk about this bad thing that Tom has done that I haven't done, it makes me look good, right? And that's what we love to do as humans, right? We want to compare ourselves this way, right, to humans. Because I can be better than Tom, but I can't be, I can't be perfect, but I can be better than Tom, But that's not how God, that's not how God deals with us and deals with our sin, right? He compares us to himself, right? He doesn't compare us horizontally, he compares us vertically, right? He compares us to perfection. He doesn't care that I'm better than Tom. I may not be better than Tom, I don't know. We'll have to check later. But he doesn't compare me to Tom. He compares me to Jesus. He compares me to perfection, right? So all I'm trying to do with that is just make myself feel better, right? Yeah, all right. Let's see here. So this way of judging others isn't helpful. It's based on jealousy, and it's based on a self-righteous desire to try to look better than someone else, okay? So this passage is very similar to a passage in Matthew that is quoting Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount, his famous Sermon on the Mount. So let's look at this. In Matthew 7, verses 1 through 5, Jesus says some very similar things to what James was just saying right here, and he gives us a good illustration that makes it even clearer. In Matthew 7, verse 1, Jesus says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way that you judge others, you're going to be judged. With the measure that you use, it's going to be measured to you." Then he gives us this really interesting illustration. Check this out. He says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to this plank, piece of wood, sticking out of your eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Hey, let me take that little piece of sawdust out,' when you got this big old plank hanging out of your eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to help remove the speck from your brother's eye." So a couple of interesting things going on here. Let me break it down. This ridiculous illustration that Jesus uses of the self-righteous person trying to tell someone about the small issue that they're seeing in their neighbor when they've got a much larger issue with pride, self-righteousness, envy, jealousy, right? So just like James, Jesus is telling us to turn our self-righteous judgment inward first, to remove the plank from our own eye, look at our own problems, use the measurement that we're trying to use on someone else on ourselves first. So when you find yourself about to start talking about someone else, about to start looking at a problem that you see in someone else, Jesus tells us to first ask ourselves, What are my motivations for this? Am I trying to make myself just a peg up so that I think that somehow that makes me closer to God? Do I have that same problem in myself? So examine yourself first. Now, unfortunately, these two passages from James and from Jesus here are often taken out of context in an attempt to say that the Bible, and Jesus specifically, forbids any form of judgment of others, right? Judge not, that you be not judged. Seems like he's saying, don't ever judge anybody. And you'll find many people misusing these passages to justify themselves, right? People say, you can't judge me. Only God can judge me, right? With the implication always being, so I can do whatever I want, right? Because can't nobody tell me what to do. God's not down here saying it, right? And a lot of times, unfortunately, these are the only verses people know out of the Bible. But that position is not true. There is definitely a wrong way to judge, and most of the time when we are doing judgment of others, we are doing it in the wrong way that Jesus just pointed out and James pointed out. But there is a right way to judge too, and let's look at that. Right? Because in those verses we just looked at, Jesus said, after you take the plank out of your eye, then you can help your neighbor with the small piece of sawdust in their eye. So in the final verses of his book in James 5, 19 through 20, James actually tells us that explicitly there is a right way and a right motivation to judge. So let's look at that. In James 5, 19 through 20, it says, my brothers and sisters, if one of you should wander from the truth and someone should bring that person back, remember this, whoever turns a sinner from the error of their way will save them from death and will cover over a multitude of sins. But look at the huge difference, right, between what James is describing, this sort of going to someone about a sin in someone else's life, and what he was talking about in verse 4, right? Bringing a brother or sister back from an error is very differently described than the slandering and gossiping about a brother or sister earlier in chapter 4. So we don't have going to someone else, right? It doesn't say if you see that someone's got a sin in their life, go to your friend and talk about them behind their back. No. It says, and it implies there's go one-on-one to this person and talk with them and help them to see this error. All right, James doesn't go into a lot of detail about how that's done, but Paul does in his letter to the church in Galatia. So in Galatians 6, verses 1 through 4, look at this real quick. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. That's going to be important. Restore that person gently. But watch yourself, or you might also be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Look at this. If anyone thinks that there's something when they're not, they deceive themselves. We'll get into that. Each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. All right? So it encapsulates a lot of the wrong way that judgment is done and the right way that judgment's done. Look at this model for right judgment here. If we see someone that's caught in a sin, what does Paul tell us to do? Once again, does he say go to your friend and talk about him? No, he says specifically go and talk to that person. Okay, but how? Am I supposed to go and yell at him? No, he says do it gently, right? Not passing harsh judgment, but gently, out of love, right? It's to be done out of love, to help them overcome a problem, not to bash them in the head with things that you think are wrong in their life. In no way could this kind of right judgment here be considered anything like slander or gossip, right? And look again in verse 3 and 4. Paul, like Jesus and James, again cautions us that even this kind of judgment of others, right? Even the right kind of judgment of others can be dangerous, and that we should always be testing our own actions and not comparing ourselves to fellow humans, right? Constantly keeping love and gentleness for our brothers and sisters as the main purpose for the correction, right? Ephesians 4:12, speak the truth in love. 4:15, speak the truth in love. constantly being aware that our typical, our normal, our natural inclination is to be self-righteous and to judge in the wrong way. So as I start wrapping up here, the Bible is clear that we are always to look at ourselves first before we look at someone else, right? To use the same measure that we're about to try to apply to someone else on our own self first. There's both a wrong kind of judgment and a right or biblical kind of judgment. The wrong judgment is what is constantly turning people away from the faith, because they see Christians as just a bunch of self-righteous hypocrites, which is what we are when we do this wrong judgment. Right judgment must always be done extremely carefully, right? Because our tendency is to do it wrong. In humility, knowing our tendency towards the wrong kind of judgment, always in love. And remember Jesus' words from Matthew 7. How are they going to know you're a Christian? They will know you're a Christian by your love. All right, so what about you? All right, let's think about our own selves for a second. How do we need to deal with this? Have you found yourself caught up in this kind of fighting? Have you been guilty of coveting what your brothers or sisters in Christ have instead of loving them? Have you been guilty of judging your brothers and sisters in the wrong way, trying to make yourself look better, right? Instead of loving them. I mean, here is the scariest but most important question that we need to ask ourselves. If someone who wasn't a Christian looked at us, looked at Unite, looked at you, looked at your life, and they are. Someone who wasn't a Christian looked at how you've been treating your fellow believers, would they want to be a part of that family? Jesus said they will know you're Christians not because you go to church. They will know you're Christians not because, you believe a certain way. They will know you're Christians by how you love other Christians. So why are they going to want to be a part of a family that hates each other? Let me leave you with this. The greatest description of love in the Bible is given by Paul to the Corinthian church. So 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 8. So let me read this to you, and you pay attention. You think about, is this how I look? This is what love is according to God. Is that in me? He says, love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It doesn't dishonor others. It's not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. It keeps no records of wrong. It doesn't delight in evil, but it does the opposite. It rejoices in the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Love never fails. So examine yourself tonight, Christian. If someone were to look at your life, is that what they would see? Would they be drawn to Christ by your actions? Let's pray. Dear God,